Can I ask,
You guys are gonna get a ticket here.
that out, have
You're gonna get a
seen
ticket
the
here
Q gospel?
because it's a gate. Yeah, I was gonna park here
Have you
earlier,
seen
and
the
the
Q
officer
gospel?
told me not to. Unless you're gonna be quick, then
The Q gospel.
yeah.
So I would say I've seen it in like remnants of Matthew and Luke's gospel. So there's
No,
like
but
relics or remnants.
okay, so you haven't actually seen the actual gospel. You've only been told about it.
So it's a hypothesis, but it's not just
Okay.
a hypothesis, but it's the best hypothesis that's accepted by the majority of scholars.
Well, it's not accepted by any actual scholars. They say there's the potential, but no one has been able to find any evidence for it actually existing.
So have you heard of a scholar by the name of Daniel Wallace? Daniel
Yes.
E. Wallace. So he accepts the Q document. He's written an online paper called In Defense of Q. I believe that's the title. There's James D.G. Dunn. He's another scholar. I believe Bruce Metzger, he also accepted the hypothesis. Barterman, he accepts the hypothesis.
No, actually, each of them have said this has been a hypothesis, but
Yeah.
they didn't say that it does exist. They haven't found any evidence for it whatsoever, including no manuscript evidence or not even a commentary of a manuscript evidence.
So a hypothesis is a solution or an explanation to an existing problem. And the existing problem is, how do you explain the relationship between Matthew and Luke, independent of Mark's gospel? And so the best hypothesis that majority of scholars accept is the Q hypothesis, vis-a-vis alternative hypothesis. So the alternative is what Mark Goodacre says, which is that Luke basically copied Matthew and Mark. So Chris, Daniel Wallace, he's a respectable scholar. He's evangelical, and he's one of the leading New Testament Greek grammarians. So he defends the Q hypothesis. What he says is that the reason why we don't have any physical copies of Q is because if Matthew and Luke copied Q into their gospels and they virtually copied all of Q, then Q would have become a redundant document because people would have just had access to Q through Matthew and Luke. And so Matthew and Luke, they would have replaced Q, and hence why people stopped copying Q or making further copies of Q. So he says basically, this is why we don't have any like independent document of Q, because it simply got replaced by Matthew and Luke.
Yeah.
My
problem is we have commentaries from the 1st and early 2nd century that refer to the Gospels. So they refer to the 4 that we have, but we don't have any commentary that even mentions a Q Gospel. Not even a implication that there was this Q Gospel. So it is entirely speculation, which is why I was asking about that, because you're saying from reading the Q Gospel. And so that would imply that someone's seen the Q Gospel.
So if you look at Papias, for example, what he has to say about Matthew's Gospel, the description that he gives of Matthew does sound more like a Q document when he refers to Matthew as being a collection of sayings of the Lord, whereas the Matthew that we have is a lot more than just sayings of Jesus, but it also has narratives as well. Whereas the Q Gospel is primarily a collection of sayings of Jesus.
So how do we know that though?
So basically, when you compare Matthew and Luke together, they have special material which are common amongst them, but they appear in different chapters and in different contexts. So if you take, for example, the Lord's Prayer, in Matthew's Gospel, the Lord's Prayer is delivered by Jesus as part of a sermon that he gives. But in Luke's gospel, the Lord's Prayer appears as an answer to a question from the disciples of how shall we pray? And then Jesus answers them and says, when you pray, say, Our Father in heaven, and so on. So they both appear in different chapters, but structure the word for word the same. And so this seems to point to some common source document that both Matthew and Luke had access to, in addition to Mark's gospel.
They're
Because
not actually they're not actually word for word though. They're very close, but they're not actually word for word.
the syntax is almost identical.
Yep.
It's just the chronology that they appear in is different. And the only time when Matthew and Luke both seem to agree in chronology is when Mark's gospel is present. But when Mark is not there, then Matthew and Luke, they have different chronologies. Um, but at the same time, they still have this, like, about 200 sayings of Jesus that appear. And so scholars ask the question as to where did they get these extra sayings of Jesus from, if since they don't find them in Mark's gospel. And so scholars theorize that they must have had a secondary document, which scholars label as Q. And
If
so yeah.
oh sorry, if they were copies of this original source, wouldn't they have the same chronological order?
So if it's a collection of sayings of Jesus, they wouldn't necessarily have any context, but it's just simply a collection of sayings. And then Matthew and Luke, they're free to insert those sayings in wherever they see fit.
Right.
And hence why you have the Lord's Prayer, for example, appearing in different contexts according to their own, perspectives, or the reasons as to why they want to do it this way.
If they were eyewitness accounts of people who actually heard Jesus say that, would they
Yeah.
also be similar?
Yeah.
So wouldn't that explain why the eyewitness accounts are similar? Because they were eyewitnesses? Or interviewing eyewitnesses, as Luke's account was?
Sure, but would they also not have, like, the eyewitnesses? They could have also documented and written down what they heard Jesus say, and then
Mm-hmm.
that document, gets passed down, and then eventually Matthew and Luke have their own copies of that document that the disciples may have initially have written, and then
Yep.
them in their own ways use that document.
But none of the Gospels mention the fall of the temple, which was 70 AD. Jesus died around 33 AD. So that leaves 40 years for not just the Q gospel to be written, for it to be circulated, for the other gospels to be written, and then for the Q gospel to be lost. Does that seem odd? That cycle would happen in a place that doesn't have text or email?
Well, 10 years, it can be a long time. Like, a lot of stuff can be said and done in that period. And we also have, like, the so-called Gnostic Gospels as well, like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Peter, for example. And none of them necessarily mention the destruction of the temple, but that doesn't mean that they weren't written after the temple was destroyed in AD 70. And so most
No, they were
scholars do
written
actually think
late 200s, like 230, 240
it's
AD.
second or third century, yeah.
Third century, yeah. But
Oh,
there were lots of writings in the first and early second century that almost all include the destruction of the temple because it was such a pivotal thing for Christians and for Jews.
I mean, Thomas, for example, is regarded as being second century, and Thomas doesn't make
Third
mention
century.
of well, Graham Stanton, for example, or Mark Goodacre. They would date it from the second century.
Okay.
And then you have the Jesus Seminar scholars like John Dominic Crossan, he would say that there's at least parts of Thomas that go back to the 1st century. And they would say that even some of the words of Jesus or the historical Jesus may be found in the Gospel of Thomas as well.
Yep.
Remember to be praying as we're talking here. We all have to pray. And let me go to what I was going to say. I was going to say this. If all the Gospels said verbatim the same thing, you know what would happen? I would say collusion. This guy sat down together and said, hey, let's write exactly what we want to say. In order for it to be eyewitness and to be really accepted, it has to have seemingly contradictions and different information. So the case can be actually put together instead of, okay, this thing was made up and everybody agreed to say the same thing. I just wanted to say that. Go ahead, Chris.
Okay. Yeah. So do you see what I mean about, like, I take your point about the Gospel of Thomas not mentioning the fall of the temple, but even still, the fact that there is this compressed time frame for not only a book to be written, but for it to be used as the copy for another 2 books and then completely forgot seems very unlikely to me. Doesn't that seem unlikely?
I forgot I was on mute. If you take into consideration that if Matthew, for example, if he copied, say, like maybe 99% of Q, if not 100%, then it would make sense as to why we would no longer have Q, since Matthew simply incorporated Q into his gospel and simply, replaced it. And so,
But if
if
he
people,
copied 99 to 100% of the gospel, wouldn't it be the gospel Matthew?
so Matthew would not just have copied Q, but he would have also had extra sayings of Jesus and extra stories, because Q doesn't have any resurrection narrative, nor does it have any birth story, nor does it have like any miracle stories. So
But we don't know
Matthew,
what Q has.
so Q, we can compare it with Luke's gospel and those sayings that we find that are common to both Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. Those we can assume fairly confidently are part of the Q document or the Q hypothesis. Barton
Why?
and because
Why can't they be eyewitness accounts?
do you mean the Gospel of Matthew or you mean the Q Gospel?
I mean, the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke having similar statements because the eyewitnesses remembered similar statements.
Yes, so if there's a Q document and that Q document was from the disciples of Jesus or from the eyewitnesses, and then Matthew and Luke incorporate that into their Gospels, then that would make sense as to why Matthew and Luke have like eyewitness testimony contained within them, in addition to other information as well.
Well, my
Can I
problem,
ask a quick question with what you're saying, Chris? No, my question will be quick. So if me, Chris, you, and Delmy went to go see a movie and we came back and Johnny asked us, hey, what was the movie about? Could we tell an accurate representation of the movie, even though some things may differ? Like maybe I'll talk about a scene where they're cooking in the kitchen, but Chris doesn't tell that part. But the core of the movie, the story, we can all relay without a doubt. Wouldn't that be reliable? Even though there can be some differences here and there, doesn't mean they're inaccurate. We can all say what the movie's about, but some of us are going to have something to say about the movie that stuck out to us more than others.
Yeah, I agree.
So I guess that's my issue, is the assumption being that there's this Q document rather than the assumption being that there are eyewitnesses, because the stories aren't word for word. If they were copying from a word for word document, then the sayings would be word for word because they're copying word for word. But the sayings aren't word for word. They're very, very close, but they're not word for word. Like the story of the paralyzed man being lowered through the roof. One of them says the Pharisees thought to each other, and Jesus knew their thought. Another one said the Pharisees discussed with each other, and Jesus responded. So they're incredibly similar, but they're not word for word the same.
I'm told if you read them in the Greek, it becomes more clear that they're like word for word the same.
They're not.
But the differences may be accounted for is like we don't have like a autograph copy of Mark's gospel. So just like we have a copy of Mark, Matthew and Luke would have also had a copy of Q and also a copy of Mark's gospel, which may have been slightly different, like in wordings, but the meaning or the message may have still been the same. So Matthew's using a version of Mark and a version of Q, which is slightly different from the version that Luke had used.
Okay.
But the meaning, yeah.
But that gets you back into even more trouble, because if there's multiple copies of the Q document that are being passed around, and Christians had a habit of copying documents, why is the Q not even a piece of it ever been found?
We can say it's been found in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke.
No, but you can't say that because they're the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. You can hypothesize that it might have occurred and might have been used, but until you actually show any evidence for it, you can't say it exists in them. You can say it could theoretically exist in them.
I mean, evidence comes in different shapes, sizes. It's not just physical or archaeological evidence, but it can also be relational as well. So, the Philippians letter of Paul, he cites early Christian prayers.
Yep.
Like the Philippian poem. So even though there's no physical or independent evidence for the existence of a pre-Pauline hymn, but this is just based upon like scholars analyzing the Greek and comparing it and concluding that there was some early hymn that Paul copied or incorporated into his letters. And there's other examples like the Resurrection Creed that Paul says that I pass down onto you, that Jesus died for our sins and was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. Even though there's no independent evidence for like a creed, but this is just based upon reading Paul's letters and comparing it. And
Well, Isaiah
scholars,
53 specifically says that that's going to happen with the Messiah, as well as the Gospels specifically say that as well. So Paul might not have had all the Gospels because John is likely to have been written after his letters, but his phrasing makes it seem likely that he might have had Matthew's Gospel with some of his later letters.
So what
but
is
Isaiah was 600 years earlier.
I'm sorry, Chris. I'm sorry.
No, go for it.
I was just going to ask, what's your name again? I'm so sorry.
Oh, no, it's fine. It's Naz.
Naz. Nice to meet you, Naz. I'm kniesha.
Felicia.
Kniesha for the K. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so I just wanted to ask, so like, do you see that the core stories in all four gospels are the same, or is it the minute details, such as, again, using the movie reference just as an example? Do you see the flow of the core of the gospels going together at least? Because that would be the main.
Yeah. I think the main story in the Gospels is the death and resurrection of Jesus. So all of them say that Jesus died and he resurrected. So the Gospels are referred to as passion narratives with long introductions. So they're really about the death and resurrection of Jesus, but we have like a introduction leading up to Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection.
Do you guys accept? Well, let me ask you personally. I'm sorry. Do you accept the death and resurrection of Jesus?
No.
And is that?
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying I don't mean to be disrespectful or anything like that, but
You're not.
I'm just telling you my position.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's what we're here for. We're just talking.
Says, sorry, Surah 3:54 says that Allah made it appear that Jesus had died, but it wasn't so.
Yeah, that's a common interpretation that Muslims give to Surah 4 verse 157. But strictly speaking, the verse simply means that Jesus wasn't killed nor crucified, even though it appeared that way. But it doesn't say that Allah made it so, just simply that's how it appeared so. But commonly
Well, it said that he was the best of deceivers, and so he made it appear so.
Again, it goes back to how you interpret or translate the verse. So with regards to those particular verses, there's no English translation, whether done by a Muslim or non-Muslim, that translates that they deceived and Allah deceived and Allah is the best of deceivers. But commonly it's translated as they schemed, and Allah schemed and Allah's the best of schemers or planners or plotters.
And what was the plan for the scheme? The plan or the scheme was to trick everyone into believing that Jesus was killed on the cross when he wasn't. He was substituted by someone else. Isn't that correct?
Well, again, the Quran doesn't speak of the substitution theory.
Okay,
it just simply says yes. Well, it's from the tafsir, from the commentaries of the Quran, more so than the hadith literature. The hadiths, I don't think they say anything on the subject of the crucifixion.
Yeah, I conflate those terms. My apologies.
No.
Between the surah, or between the hadiths and the tafsirs.
Yeah, yeah, it's fine. But the Quran says it appeared to them in that way, in that manner. So commonly Muslims interpret that to mean that someone else was made to look like Jesus and he was crucified in Jesus's place. But another interpretation is that Jesus was on the cross, but he didn't die, but he only appeared to have been dead. But he survived. Maybe resuscitation or CPR or something like this. So in the Gospels, the New Testament, the Gospels, they teach that Jesus died and resurrected. But what's interesting in the Gospel of Mark, Pontius Pilate was amazed that Jesus had died so soon, because Jesus was only on the cross for a few hours. And the other Gospels, they do not mention this doubt that Pilate initially had, that if Jesus was really dead, since he was only on the cross for a few hours. The Gospel of John, being the last of the four Gospels to be written, has Jesus being pierced on the side as a post-mortem examination to see whether Jesus had actually died. So to me, it does appear that the Gospels are rewriting the story of the crucifixion in order to give definitive evidence that Jesus was definitely dead on the cross and that there wasn't early doubt to Jesus's death on the cross. But Mark has that doubt, but the other Gospels, they seem to remove that doubt.
So are you familiar with human psychology? So there are 4 categories that people usually get put in, and sometimes they're referred to as colors. So there's red, green, yellow, and blue. Now, this is very important because you have to understand what kind of person relays, and not only relays, but retrieves information in a certain way. Okay, so this is very common to all human beings. Either you're like a person who's dominant, you're a person who's really shy and reserved, you're a person who takes in a lot of information and everything's detailed, you're a person who's kind of laid back, kind of going with the flow, etc. You know, like there's these different personalities that make up all of mankind. And so when we're reading something, when you actually are not like reading something to pick something apart, but actually, as we like to say, put yourself in someone's shoes, you can see why they refer to certain things in a certain way. So Matthew, very detailed, very, very detailed. I mean, everything's recorded, everything is like timeline, everything. John is more like like a, how do you say? Um
Spiritual or
yeah,
symbolic.
like a fluent type of, spiritual type of personality. So it's not that these things are contradicting or like, hey, why didn't this person talk about this? When we look at it, even from a scientific and psychological perspective as to how mankind even acts in the first place, we can see these types of personalities come out in the text. So they're not going to all have the same detail, again, because certain people process and then relay information in different ways. And what you want to look for is the flow of things. Same thing when you are comparing, um, in the Muslim belief. Okay, some people are just Quran only, right? And then others are Hadith. And what is happening is some people are receiving information a certain way, but not only that, they're looking for core things to be the same. Even if one contradicts another, you'll see some Muslims also do the same thing where it's like, okay, well, is the core the same? Is these main things the same? Sure, there might be differences here. Sure, there might be differences there. It's because it's the human way to process and relay information. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Pilate
yeah.
was concerned or was unsure about the death. He was questioning why it was so fast, but he confirmed with his centurions who were actually at the death, who said, yes, he definitely is dead. So even Mark puts that to bed, that he was actually dead.
Mark doesn't actually give us the words of the centurion, but Pilate just simply asks the centurion, and the centurion simply confirms. But by this time, the centurion would have been a believer in Jesus, because he says, for example, in Luke's gospel, truly this man was innocent. In Mark, he said, truly this man was the Son of God. And so the centurion would have a bias in not wanting to say that Jesus was alive, but he would rather just say Jesus has died, so as to save Christ or to protect him. So I'm saying that that the centurion wouldn't have been like an independent, like non-biased or impartial person, since by this time he believed in Jesus. And even Pilate as well, he didn't want to actually sentence Jesus to death, but his wife, has a dream in which she says to Pilate that no harm should come to him. And Pilate actually kept on looking for a way to release or free Jesus. So if there was a way that Pilate could actually let Jesus go, but whilst at the same time turning a blind eye, then I don't see why that couldn't have been possible. So Jesus may not have actually died, but he may have been resuscitated and then taken up by God from the tomb. And hence they schemed, but God schemed, and God is the best of schemers.
Let me say something about that. So what you're saying is that there's a possibility he was crucified then, okay?
But didn't die.
Didn't die. All right. Have you ever studied how crucifixions actually happen?
A little bit. I'm not an expert.
So crucifixion was not invented by the Romans. It was actually invented by the Persians. And then centuries later, the Romans adopted and they perfected it. And by perfecting it, I mean they made it very, very, very bloody, very, very painful, and very, very shameful. It was different than what the Persians did, and thousands upon thousands of people were crucified. There's actually a fossilized ankle that was found kind of recently of a crucified person, and the nail goes through the side of the ankle, and it's interesting because the nail has the tip that goes into the foot actually bent. So there's a theory about the reason why that's that way is that when they crucified the person, it either hit a knot in the wood or a rock on the other side, and then it bent the nail. And then later on, when they tried to remove the person from the cross, well, the bent nail was too difficult, so they cut the foot and they left the foot on the wood. And after a while, the wood rotted out, and so what's left now is the fossilized foot with the nails still in it. If you Google it, you will see the picture of it. So that's a very long nail. It's not a nail that you put a picture on the wall. And I don't know if you, as a child, had this happen to you, but I had it several times when I was a child in Brazil, running around on the in the yard on pieces of boards of wood and pieces of board, and it sometimes it happened that it had a nail, and we would step on that nail, and things would go pretty bad. And I guarantee you, if you step on a nail like that, a small nail that can put a picture on the wall, like 2-3 inches long, um, you're not gonna walk very well after after that happens. Now, people that come up with this theory that Jesus just fainted, it's called the swoon theory. It has been used by critics of the Bible for I don't know how many years. I think the very first time I heard it, it was back in 2005. That's when I started studying a few of these things. I could be wrong about that date though, but it was around that time, 2000 maybe 7 or 8, something like that. And when I talk about this, I remember those days when I stepped on nails, and you can't walk. Now imagine, and the nails never went through my foot. I've heard stories of people that stepped on those nails and he went all the way through. And if the ones that I stepped on did not um, allow me to walk for a few days properly, imagine a nail that's as thick as your thickest toe or your finger, and it goes all the way through both of your feet, not just a little bit of it like I had, but all the way through, probably rusty, and you have it through your hands too, between the what's the bones called, ulna, and forget the name of the other one. It used to be called radius. Um, and you tell me that the person that's hanging on that cross, I've done the test just by hanging. I like doing pull-ups just by hanging on the bar. Sometimes I like doing that to decompress my spine, and I know the difficulty to breathe after a while. Now you have someone that had his back ripped open by the cat of nine tails. That's a historical tool used in torture by the Romans. They had pieces of bone and glass and metal balls and hooks of metal, like fishing hooks at the tip. And when they would beat the person with that, the metal balls, I think it was actually lead balls, would turn the meat soft. And not to mention that one of the gospels says that Jesus was beat up by the whole cohort of soldiers, which is pretty much about 60 soldiers, if I'm not mistaken. And I've seen a young man actually being beat up by about 10 people that were not as strong as Roman soldiers, and that young man was not able to get up out of the floor as he was being brutally beaten by that group of people. And now Jesus is being beat up with a bag on his head. He couldn't see where the blows were coming. Our bodies have this, God built us with this natural defense. When you're about to be hit by something, your body actually creates um, a defense mechanism that prepares that area of your body to be to receive the punch or the kick or whatever. I think anybody that has been in a fight knows what I'm talking about. And when you know something's coming to hit you, and your body is prepared, but if you don't see the blow coming, like you can't predict it, your body will not have the ability to create that defense. Now Jesus has a bag on his head, about 60 soldiers beating him up. Those soldiers were much bigger than any of us as far as physical ability. Um, they're pretty good at what they did. They're like the SWAT or the Scotland Yard, or they're good. Like they're good at what they did. And then the back ripped open. Isaiah prophesied he wouldn't even look like a human being. And then he's hanging on a cross for 6 hours at least, thirsty and all that. And then 3 days later he wakes up, somehow moves the rock, and is able to walk with his hands and back and face and all. I cannot. I just think about my little foot stepping on a nail, not being able to walk, and imagining a crucifixion nail all the way through both of my feet. And 3 days later, I'm walking around. It makes no. I don't know, man. I think it takes more faith to believe that.
Have you heard of the Lazarus syndrome? This is when someone is declared dead, clinically dead.
Yeah, catalepsy or something like that.
Yeah. So these people, they're certified dead by medical professionals, but then later on it is found that there was a mistake made or an error. So even professionals or doctors, they can make mistakes as well, even though that's not generally the case, or that's not what normally happens. So generally, someone who's crucified, they did not survive a crucifixion, but also no one is said to have come back from the dead after the crucifixion. The only time in which someone is said to come back from the dead is in the case of Jesus. But the difference with Jesus is that if Jesus had actually survived crucifixion, then it would make sense as to why someone may say that he resurrected or he came back to life from the dead, because his circumstances were special and it was not the general or the normal circumstances. And Luke's gospel, Jesus isn't actually punished. So in Luke's gospel, Pontius Pilate, he actually gives the Jews the choice of either having Jesus scourged or crucified. And so the crowd, they choose to have Jesus crucified instead of being whipped. Um, and in terms of nailing, and I agree with you, it's horrible. But it doesn't mean that it happened in every single case or for every single individual. Josephus, he makes mentions that 3 of his friends were crucified, but 2 of them, 3 of them were crucified, and he uses his power to have them taken back down and given medical treatment. 2 of them die anyhow, but 1 of them actually survives.
Yeah,
They
but
weren't crucified to
I
death.
think you didn't get my point. My point is, if someone goes through that, I'm not saying that it's not possible for someone to survive. I've seen people survive. I actually met a young man that was shot through the head and he was walking.
Oh, really?
The bullet came right at the line of the hair here in the forehead, and it came outside of his ear, behind his ear. He went through his head and he survived. And I found him
That's
walking.
crazy.
Brazil is
a
not a safe place, man. If you go to Brazil, you watch yourself. People think that the Taliban place is dangerous. Well, Brazil is as dangerous.
Really?
So anyways, people will survive a lot of very traumatic
Yeah.
things. If it is not your time to die, you will survive. And people have fallen from like 30 feet or 18,000 feet. So, uh, uh, people fall from like 6 feet and die, and this guy fell from the airplane. It was like 18,000 feet or something like that. Survived. I mean, I know people will survive very extreme things. What I'm saying is, the guy that fell from the airplane was not walking 3 days later. Someone hanging on a cross, whether they've been beaten or not, they're not going to be walking 3 days later showing, hey, I resurrected. Look at me walking perfect. The disciples don't see someone that's walking like a moribund, like a zombie, like, oh man, look at this guy, poor guy, like he's all messed up. They're not seeing someone like that.
So the disciples, they did not see a bodily or physical Jesus, but Jesus would have appeared to them in a vision, in a heavenly vision, and there they see Jesus still alive, and then
No,
they go
Thomas
out
put
and
his
proclaim.
hand. Thomas put his hand in the wound.
So if you
He
go,
ate fish and honey with them.
yeah, and that's in the Gospel of Luke and John. And Luke and John, they come later. But if you go to Mark's Gospel, in the earliest, there's no
Well, you
actual
say the earliest,
resurrection.
but there's not actually evidence for that.
Well,
That's
it's
assumed.
the majority, the majority view.
There's a little bit of debate, but yeah, Matthew and Mark are the likelies, and yes.
So in Mark, there's no actual resurrection narrative where Jesus appears to the disciples in a bodily form. But if you go to the letters of Paul, I think virtually all scholars believe that Paul is the earliest of the New Testament writers. And in Paul, Jesus appears to him in a vision, in a heavenly vision. And Paul says that Jesus appeared to James and to Peter and to the 12 and to the rest. And then he says, last of all, he appeared to me. And since Jesus appears to Paul in a vision, it means that Paul also believed that Jesus appeared to the disciples in a vision and not in a resurrected state like he does in Luke and John.
Paul actually refers to himself as being abnormally born, implying that there is a big difference between the way that he converted to the way that the rest of the disciples converted.
He does say that Jesus became a life-giving spirit. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 45, he says that Jesus becomes or became a life-giving spirit. And he says that flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom. So Jesus,
do you know what he means by flesh and blood cannot inherit the kingdom?
So he means this body, this earthly body,
our bodies,
is different from the resurrected body, which is a new immortal body. So he basically believes in transformation rather than reanimation. So in the Gospels of Luke and John and in Matthew, you have Jesus being reanimated. He's not transformed, but it's the same body with which he's crucified, he's resurrected in. But this new body now can also go through walls, but it can still be touched and felt and be seen by others.
You talked about the Lazarus effect before. Do you know why it's called the Lazarus effect?
No.
Because Lazarus was brought back from the dead before Jesus was crucified.
Yep.
He had been in the tomb dead for 3 days, and Jesus called him out. There are actually several people raised from the dead in the New Testament, and between the Gospels and Acts.
Yep. And even in the Old Testament as well. Sorry.
No, you're good. I just don't want to interrupt. You guys are having a great
No, it's fine.
conversation. I just wanted to leave off with something. I'm gonna just watch. But you know, if the belief, you know, what's stated in the Quran that in the end everything is just dependent on Allah, you know, whether you are, we'll say the word saved or not, right? And get to be with him or not, then nothing really nothing really matters. But if the God of the Bible is real and he calls himself a just God and justice will be served, then it's a very serious thing for me. And there's no amount of works that you could do to ever earn your way for salvation, because if you've broken one thing in the law, you have broken them all, right? Because God is all holy. And I just want to leave you with this, that just think about the cost that you're going to put your life in right now, your eternal life. If it is true and you are held to what you have done your entire life, you're in serious trouble, just like the rest of us. Okay, that's why we need a savior, and Christ is the savior of the world. And you don't need to do anything special. It's not a ritual or amount of working hours that you have to put in for this promise. He says, just trust me. Trust me, I am who I am, and he is Almighty God. Now, I know that's a lot to take in, but I just want to leave you with that to at least think about, because it is that serious. It's not like buying a new car where you can come back later and decide. When you're dead, you're dead. And
Yeah, I
sadly,
agree.
10 out of 10 they die, you know? So I don't want to push anything on you or make you feel any type of way, but I do want to let you know
No,
that
you're not.
it's just something to think about, because I was an atheist before. I was a non-believer in God, period. I didn't care what God you were talking about. I didn't care. I was my own God, if I could put it that way. Um, and that's something I had to wrestle with. What if this is true? Like, what if, even if it's a slightest chance, and I die and I screwed it up because I didn't even give any thought to it. Not what people say and a pastor says and TV says and, you know, your teacher says, but you, you know.
Mm.
So I love you. You know, I'm sorry for interrupting you guys. I'm gonna let
No,
you
it's
guys
fine.
continue to talk, but
Thank you.
um thank you, and God bless you guys, and good
Thank you,
conversation
you
going
too.
here. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate you.
Thank you. I appreciate you guys too.
So yeah, I was just gonna say with regards to the resurrection, I'm not denying that Jesus raised people from the dead. Just my view is that the earliest view is that Jesus was taken up by God into heaven from the tomb to heaven, and which is why the tomb was discovered empty. Um, and this would also explain why there is no physical or bodily appearance of Jesus, at least not in Mark's gospel, but Mark may have initially just simply have an empty tomb story where the body of Christ is taken up and vindicated by God. In the Quran, it says that God will take Jesus and raise him up to himself. And in the New Testament, in the earliest strata of evidence, possible that Jesus was laid in the tomb to rest, and then from the tomb taken up by God into heaven.
But then returned and walked with the people. And that was foretold, remember, in Isaiah, that he would die and rise again. Isaiah 53.
Yeah, I'll say Jesus appeared to them in a vision, like in some sort of heavenly vision. But
But they
then,
literally put their hands in his side. Like, I don't understand how that seems to be different to a vision. When in the Bible it talks about a vision, they say, I had a vision. Like Peter says, I
mm,
had a vision that the foods were clean.
mm,
Revelation, he says, an angel came to me and I had a vision. Paul says Jesus appeared to me in a vision in Acts, right?
Yeah.
So when they have a vision, they say, I had a vision.
In Luke, he's depicted as being reanimated when he's resurrected. So it's not that it's a transformation of a new body, but it's simply his earthly body now being resuscitated, but it's now become immortalized and eternal.
Because they walk
But
with him, they eat with him, and yeah.
yeah, and then he also vanishes as well from their sight.
Yep.
And then they say that was our not hearts burning when he was speaking to us about the scriptures. In but in Luke's gospel, Jesus appears to the 11 in the upper room. But in John's gospel, he only appears to the 10 because Thomas is missing. And so Jesus comes back 8 days later and then appears to Thomas. And so my point is that the general story is the crucifixion and resurrection. But if you look at the details, there is a development in which the story did change over time. And I feel that the early story is more closer to the Muslim view of Jesus or what the Quran says. And
But
the
the
later
earliest story is Isaiah. And
Yeah.
Isaiah very specifically says he would die for us and make us righteous as his perfect sacrifice. So how can he not have died but die for us and make us righteous?
Well, Isaiah 53 is ambiguous when it comes to the death of the suffering servant, because it also says that he will have his life extended.
That's
so that
resurrection.
well, it doesn't say that he died. It only says that his grave was prepared amongst the dead.
It says it dies. It says that he poured his life unto death. That's what it says.
He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Seems pretty specifically that he died.
So he was assigned a grave, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he was put inside the tomb or inside the grave.
But he was actually put inside a tomb, wasn't he?
Yeah.
So he was assigned a grave 600 years earlier. It said he was going to be assigned a grave, and then he was actually put in a tomb. Doesn't that link the two, the dead and the dead? It seems very specifically talking about death.
I mean, if he was placed inside the tomb while still alive or still having signs of life, it could still fulfill that statement.
Right, but if he was still showing signs of life, then he wouldn't be considered dead to the centurion, to the people around him. He would be called alive, not dead.
The centurion could just simply be hoodwinking Pontius Pilate.
The centurion literally put him on the cross. So he wasn't in his favor until he saw how he died. The scripture even says that.
Well, it says that when there was like an earthquake and darkness in the land.
That's right.
And then he realizes that this man was innocent, but Jesus was yet still alive at the time.
So let's go back to Isaiah
he
first.
Is still alive.
Go back to Isaiah. Isaiah 53 verse 12 says that he poured his life unto death. What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's also Jeremiah chapter 11 verse 19. He also cites Isaiah 53 verse 12 in reference to his own situation.
So Jeremiah what?
Knew this was what was going to happen.
11:19.
Let me pull it up here.
If I'm not mistaken, I'm
going to pull it up, and as I'm pulling it up, you know that in the Gospel according to Mark, Jesus predicts his death a few times, death and resurrection, chapter 9 and chapter 10. and his disciples did not understand him. Like sometimes Jesus said things and the disciples did not understand. Several times, actually. He says that multiple times, and they did not get what he's saying. Actually, when Peter understands that he's going to die, Peter tries to prevent that. And he says, no, have mercy on yourself. You're not going to do it. Nobody's going to kill you. And he actually did try to prevent that by pulling the sword. The only time you see a New Testament disciple using a sword and never to be used again is that time there. And gets rebuked, put the sword back. And then decades of history in the New Testament, he never does it again, but that's a different subject. But you see Peter, when he finally understands it, he rebukes the Lord, and the Lord has to rebuke him for rebuking the Lord. Like it's interesting that the disciple rebuking the master. Uh, and he verbatim says, I will die, I'll go to Jerusalem, they will mock me, they will spit on me, they will crucify me, and then on the third day, I'll rise again. And he actually says die. So
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. If you look at the behaviors of the disciples, none of them know that he was to be resurrected on the third day. The women, when they go to the tomb and they find the tomb to be empty, they think that the body has been taken away and moved to another location.
yeah, they don't understand. Just like the prophets in the Old Testament did not understand a lot of things that they were saying. It's a
And
normal thing.
John,
It's a normal
who
thing
was
for
supposed
human
to be
beings not to understand what God is saying. Do you think Adam understood what God said to him when God said you're going to die the day you eat the fruit? Or Daniel? Daniel himself said, I did not understand the words that the angel had spoken to him. It's a normal thing.
yeah. But John says that they did not understand the scripture that the Messiah was to be resurrected on the third day. It
yeah.
wasn't that Jesus had predicted his death, but John seems to contradict by saying that they did not know that the Messiah was to rise on the third day according to the scriptures, rather than according to what Jesus had predicted or had already told them. So most scholars think that the predictions that Jesus makes in the first three gospels, these were added later,
No,
that Jesus did not predict his resurrection, but the gospel writers themselves had the view that Jesus would rise on the third day. And so they wrote Jesus predicting his resurrection on the third day. Whereas if Jesus did predict his resurrection, then you wouldn't expect John to have this statement that the disciples did not understand or knew that the Messiah was to be raised on the third day according to the scriptures. And you wouldn't
there's
have, yeah.
there's a difference between him having predicted it and them not understanding it, and him not having predicted it. They can still he can still have
Understooding. I'm
predicted it
sorry, man. I had to
and
laugh about this understooding.
understanding. Sorry, they they predicted it, but that doesn't. Ted, sorry. They
It's
predict
fine.
him predicting the
Yeah,
resurrection and
on the
telling them
third
about
day.
it
Yeah.
didn't click in their heads until he resurrected. And then they
So
remembered what he said and went, oh, he did tell us about that. Still works with John's statement.
according to Dave, the disciples, they did actually understood. Like, Peter says to Jesus, Lord, forbid this from happening. So in one place it shows they did understand, but in another place it shows they have no awareness. Like when the women come up to them and tell them that Jesus is resurrected just as he had prophesied, the disciples think the women are speaking nonsense. They think that the women, are just speaking nonsense or foolishness or something to this effect. So
Yep.
why would they think that the women are speaking foolish if Jesus had already told them that he would resurrect? And Peter
But
says,
but then they met him and went, ah, so when you said these things, that meant you were going to come back. when you said you were going to rebuild the temple in 3 days, that meant that you were going to come alive again. You know how sometimes things click once you see the outcome?